I'm pretty sure it's just over this ridge. Every journey has a destination. Every story has the hope of a happy ending. The story of the Bible begins with the creation of the world and humanity's fall into brokenness. God then gives us the main plot of the story. That billions and billions of people from all over the earth will be blessed through one of Abraham's descendants. And this blessing can be ours by believing his promises. So, what ending does God have in mind for the world? Where will our journey end up? After Genesis, the next few books of the Bible retell the period of human history from about 1800 to 1000 BC. During this time, Abraham's grandchildren moved to Egypt, where after about 400 years, they've grown into a great nation. But they're slaves. What does God do? He rescues them from slavery and brings them to the land he promised them, Israel. A few hundred years later, they become a kingdom ruled by Israel's greatest Old Testament king, King David. And it's to David that God reveals something vital about how the story of God's people will finally end. Throughout his early life and the beginning of his reign, David accomplishes so much for God's people. He leads them, he defeats their enemies, he keeps them safe from attack. This was a time of real peace and prosperity for God's people. David even wondered if they'd come to the end of their journey. So he decides to build a temple to mark God's presence with his people. But God had a different plan in mind.
The Lord declares to you that the Lord himself will establish a house for you. When your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he shall be my son. Your house and your kingdom shall endure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever.
Like sitting down and scrolling through pictures of the place you're going on holiday, God gives David a glimpse of what the journey's end would look like. The story of God's people wasn't going to end with David building a house for God, but with God building a kingdom for his people. In one sense, God's promise was one for David's son, King Solomon. Solomon went on to build the temple that David had in mind, and the kingdom of Israel reached the height of its prosperity and success. However, God's promise to King David was far greater than any earthly kingdom. See, earthly kingdoms come and go. All through history, you see nations rise and fall, and the kingdom of Israel was no different. After Solomon's death, the kingdom split in two. There was the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. Both these kingdoms eventually came to an end. Israel in 720 BC and Judah in 586 BC when Jerusalem fell to the Babylonians. But the kingdom that God promised he would build was going to be a kingdom unlike any other. It was going to be a perfect kingdom, free from the brokenness of sin, and one where we're able to stand before God. And it was going to be a forever kingdom, one that would never come to an end. How can this be? Well, this kingdom would have a perfect forever king, someone who would rule and reign into eternity. God tells us two very important things about this forever king. First, this king would be one of David's descendants.
When your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood, and I will establish his kingdom.
And second, God makes it clear that this king would actually be God's own son.
I will be his father, and he shall be my son.
God promised King David that he would build a kingdom of people that would never end. And he promised that they would have a king, a descendant of David, who would be none other than God's own son. Hundreds of years passed, and king after king after king sat on the throne. Every king that came was a descendant of King David, and yet all of them died. None of them remained on the throne forever. In the Bible, you get David's family tree listed a couple of times. Every son born in David's line was born of a human father. None of them were God's own son. So what's going on? Has God forgotten his promise? Who was God even talking about? These were some of the common questions asked by God's people throughout the long history of the Old Testament. But before the answers came, before this king and kingdom were to be established, God's people still had a few more steps of the journey ahead of them. The story of the Bible was not over yet. Every journey has a destination. Every story has the hope of a happy ending. The Lord's promise to King David shows us where God was planning to take his people. It reveals what the ending of the Bible's story will look like. Through faith in God's promises, God's people will be part of the most incredible, perfect, and forever kingdom. And that kingdom will be ruled by a perfect, forever king. I wonder, is this where your life is heading? Is this how your story will end?